Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. My name is Kat Lyons and I work as a network associate for the Network for Landscape Conservation. Thank you so much for joining us or whatever time zone you're in right now. I just wanted to provide a brief introduction to the network, do some quick logistics, and then we'll get started with our fantastic panel this evening. So the Network for Landscape Conservation is pleased to continue the Landscape Conservation and Action webinar series into the spring and into the summer. A brief overview of our network. We launched in 2011, and the Network for Landscape Conservation is a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation, really striving to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. This network is a community as much as an organization, really a community that is connected by the shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. A few quick logistics before I hand it off. As we listen to the presenters, please submit your questions in the chat and don't be shy to have that conversation there. I'll be tracking the questions as they come in. And this webinar will be a little bit more discussion based. So we hope that you guys can contribute a lot to the questions that we have in the chat. The presenters will provide a brief introduction to their work, and from there, all the panelists will be introduced to discuss the Australian exchange, some outcomes, and the benefits of the international peer exchange that you came to listen to today. And the Q&A will be facilitated by one of our panelists who will be working to incorporate your questions as much as possible. So with that, I will hand it off to Travis, who will introduce himself and get the webinar underway. Thanks.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks everyone for joining this evening. My name is Travis Anklum. I work at the University of Montana at a small applied research center called the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. We do a lot of work with federal and state agencies, tribes, conservation nonprofits to help bring folks together to work through conflicts around the environment and create shared pathways for success moving forward. And I'm really excited to be here with some of my colleagues from both Australia and the US who participated in a peer exchange, international peer exchange last fall. I'm also seeing that there's a couple of other folks from Australia who are joining who helped us co-convene the exchange and participated in it. So I'm delighted that you could start your day off with us. And our agenda for this evening is really to explore what the peer exchange last fall looked like in Eastern Australia, to hear from our panelists who continue to be working with one another after the exchange around why they participated, what they got out of the exchange, and what they see as next steps going forward. And then we'll have some facilitated discussion around the value of peer exchange, offer an opportunity for folks who are joining us this evening to ask questions, and just explore where you all see opportunities for international peer exchange and maybe see the value of peer exchange with conservation and stewardship practitioners going forward. I'm going to actually turn it over to our first panelist, Shelana deSilva, to give us an overview of the entity that we're with, Global Landscape Stewards, and the exchange last year. And then we'll go through our panelists who will each introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they do and why they participated in the exchange, what they got out of it, before handing it back to you all for questions. Shelana, do you want to take us through some framing and a little bit of an overview?
Yeah, thanks, Travis. Hi, everybody. It's great to see all of you, some familiar faces. My name is Shelana deSilva. I'll introduce myself more fully later, but right now, as Travis said, I want to just kind of walk us through who are the Global Landscape Stewards and kind of the impetus for our exchange. I'm going to share my screen here and make sure that everyone can see that. Does that look good? Okay, great. So the Global Landscape Stewards are a group of practitioners working at the landscape scale with really diverse backgrounds. We're all practitioners, but we come from a variety of different work areas. We're academics, ecologists, some of us are practicing place-based science, applied science in our work. I do policy work. There are others among us who also are doing advocacy and policy community organizing. A really broad range of ways that we intersect with this work. But I think the thing that brought us all together is this shared understanding that the issues of the day that we're all facing, right? Climate change, these clarion calls for social equity, biodiversity loss, were frankly outstripping even our shared capacity to problem solve. And so we realized that we needed to look beyond our own borders and be somewhat boundaryless in our search for solutions. So we decided that the first place we would go is Australia, and there was a lot of discussion about, why Australia. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that there were similar challenges that we were learning about that practitioners in Australia were facing, as many of us are from California and Montana, other parts of the country as well, but a lot of similar challenges in terms of wildfire, biodiversity loss, and then of course, partnering with Indigenous practitioners. So a lot of opportunity as well, that we saw plenty of overlap between kind of what we were looking at and what folks in Australia were looking at. So zeroed in on this amazing continent as our first sort of trip of exchange. Most of our time was spent on the eastern coast of Australia, and we did get all the way down to Tasmania, which was amazing. And that's what this photo is here, the Midlands and Tasmania. The purpose of our trip really was around connecting practitioners who are working in a diversity of contexts, but all at the landscape scale, work focusing on stewardship. We also wanted to accelerate the exchange of best practices and ideas. Again, really looking at crowdsourcing solutions to some of these problems that we're all facing today in our work. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that place-based work was scaling up to what we hope can be a global movement of landscape stewards. We went into this, of course, understanding that there is a ton of complexity in trying to think about those sort of impetus for our work. And through a year of exchange meetings virtually with our colleagues in Australia, focused in on these 3 priority areas. Again, it's really about that peer exchange and relationship building. We wanted to make sure that we had a chance to create lasting, durable relationships with our colleagues in Australia. And then also to really expand our awareness of solutions that might be replicable across a variety of contexts. So build that knowledge base, share what we were working on and what solutions we've been coming up with in our work, and as well learn from our colleagues in Australia. And then ensure again that relevant place-based work was informing the creation and sort of nourishing a global landscape stewardship movement that is inclusive and effective. So again, going back to this idea of relationship building and peer exchange as sort of the heartbeat of this work, wanting to make sure that there was an ongoing connection, that we could all sort of leverage each other's learnings, our solutions to problems, and frankly, the solidarity in doing this work that is both inspiring and incredible, but also challenging. So for our next steps, we want to keep these relationships going, of course. And so part of the way we want to do that is to think about future in-person exchanges so we can connect people from a variety of different regions. Again, looking at those broad suite of solutions, what's replicable in one context may be replicable in another with some adaptation. We want to continue to increase our knowledge and share our tools and our tips with each other through knowledge building workshops, virtually and ideally in person as well, whenever possible. And then we want to make sure that we have events that are connecting to practitioners across the globe, so that we really expand this idea of peer exchange beyond this group that came together in Australia, to be inclusive of other landscapes, other places around the world that may benefit from shared knowledge and relationship building. Again, all in the service of being able to apply these skills to our work of landscape stewardship around the world. And Travis, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Shelana, for that overview. And I'll turn to our other panelists to introduce themselves in greater detail and what they got out of the exchange, why they participated. And then maybe we can round out with you, Shelana, to share those reflections yourself. Deb, I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself and speak to why you participated in the exchange and what you got out of it.
Sure. So my name is Deb Davidson, based in Bozeman, Montana, and I'm the Vice President at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. I also wear the hat of associate director for the Network for Landscape Conservation. And I was thrilled to be part of this exchange. And I would say I was actually thrilled to be part of the exchange, but also the co-creation we did for the year before the exchange, which I think was equally powerful. And I really appreciated that. I also appreciate the continued relationships we have going forward. My work, and the reason I was intrigued by Australia and also this approach, was because two reasons. So I work on ecological connectivity. Our work is completely focused on taking a large landscape approach to ensuring we have healthy and vibrant wildlife habitat, watersheds, and places for humans to recreate and have livelihoods from. So ecological connectivity can be categorized as wildlife corridors, connectivity, habitat linkages. But the bottom line with all that work is that it's the messy middle in our landscapes, and it's the landscapes in between our protected areas. It's the landscapes where we live. It's the landscapes where we have roads and rails, where often our logging and other natural resource extraction takes place. But it's also landscapes where animals almost always have to move from one protected area to another. And the reason I was particularly excited about Australia is because in so many ways, the way that country is developed, the challenges that they're facing from a drought, wildfire, natural resource restoration topics, as well as the grappling that the country is doing around Indigenous rights and the role that co-management has. It's the work that we do every day and that we see here in the United States, but we're also seeing in other places across the globe. CLC we've been using exchanges like this as part of our theory of change since we started. We started 14 years ago, and the idea of knowledge sharing and learning best practices from other partners has been the basis of our work. Come back to that messy middle statement. Our work is really challenging. It's not straightforward, and learning different techniques from partners like in Australia is critical to figure out, well, gosh, what worked there? What was the secret to success to dealing with the massive wildfires that took place in 2000, or was it 2001 or 2021? Sorry. What can we learn from that? So just emphasizing that that's one of the reasons I was particularly excited. So it's from the connectivity perspective. It was from this that I just think that exchanges are critically important for moving forward this community of practice. And also from an efficiency standpoint, we are at a crisis point in the globe, and none of us have time to be recreating the wheel. And so how do we learn from one another? And I took away a lot of key lessons and ideas for best practices that we've been starting to incorporate into our work. And I'll just reference a few of them, I think, which are really important. Australia has had a long history of tackling connectivity conservation and taking a large landscape approach, and the Great Eastern Ranges work, the work that Bush Heritage is doing, and the work that ALCA is moving forward. I really loved some of their approaches, including learning about some of their federal work that they have done that was 20 years ago, and how it's kind of having a resurgence, and what can be applied here in the United States, and what lessons can we share with them. So that was really particularly interesting to me. I also work on capacity building at a network level through the Network for Landscape Conservation. And so I was in some ways sad to realize the similar challenges exist in Australia, but also, and what I mean by that is that, you know, as we all know that there's a need for more on the ground, locally led conservation efforts in all of our countries. And that's one of the most effective approaches to conservation. But that often means, it means that we need capacity on the ground to be able to carry that work out. And so, common theme to here, you know, that we're in the United States, we're at that same challenge. How do we ensure that we have effective conservation on the ground that's being locally driven? and how do we ensure those resources get to people on the ground? That was the same conversation we had in Australia. So capacity and increased coordination is one of the things they're grappling with. And one of the things that I think that we can continue, we collectively, Global Landscape Stewards and our work at CLSC, can continue to partner with partners in Australia on to figure out how we move that needle. And then the last thing I'll mention is we work globally. So my work is very global, and we have projects all over the globe on connectivity conservation. And it was interesting. And also, I think there was some partnership that was developed around the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted through the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it was great to see and partner with colleagues from Australia when that huge global gathering happened in December, when the Global Biodiversity Framework was ratified by the 120 countries, or how many ever countries ended up signing it, 180. But I think there's just that power of being connected to others who have common goals, and knowing we could do some exploration on how our countries can meet the 30 by 30 targets, and really thinking about that at a national level and comparing notes. So that conversation continues. You know, Jody and her work and others, we're still having that conversation around how we leverage each other's experiences around the Global Biodiversity Framework and share lessons and challenges. So those are my highlights. And Australia is a beautiful country, and I loved being there. I'll pass it back to you, Travis.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Appreciate all those reflections and insights, and it's really exciting to hear how you're continuing to work together with Australian colleagues going forward. On that note, I'd like to turn it over to Jody Gunn to introduce herself and speak a little bit about your organization, Australian Land Conservation Alliance, and why you participated in the exchange, co-convened it, and what you got out of it. Jody, I can't quite hear you.
Hi again. Thank you, Travis. Great to speak to you today and to hear from our colleagues over in the US in this discussion today. It's great to see you all and continue the connection and network through this discussion. I'm Jody Gunn. I am the CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance that Travis just mentioned. I'm sharing some slides just because I think, you know, we're speaking from Australia to a largely American audience, and so pictures sometimes just can help in creating the context and imagery around how we've been operating and working together and part of the program that we helped to co-design. So I'd like to acknowledge, before I get started, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on whose country that I'm joining from today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, their land, their water and cultural stewardship is more than 60,000 years old and continues through today. The opportunity for stewardship exchange for Indigenous peoples globally is really significant, and having the opportunity to explore that through this stewardship program, but also, you know, as Deb mentioned, being in Montreal and seeing, you know, the really strong Indigenous people and local community connection happening at a global level is really powerful and significant. And I'm encouraged by some of the relationships that we're able to develop through this exchange that we'll be talking about today, but also recognise the opportunities for global Indigenous stewardship exchange should be strengthened in their own right. The Australian Land Conservation Alliance represents organisations that work to protect, to manage and to restore nature across privately managed land. So together we address some of the most pressing conservation issues. Some of those that have been mentioned by Travis and Deb, they include restoring endangered ecosystems, building protected area estate, tackling invasive species, and expanding conservation finance and funding. ALCA is a membership organisation, a peak body. Collectively, currently our members represent more than $260 million worth of annual turnover. We have collectively more than 70,000 supporters. We engage with thousands of landholders right across Australia through our membership reach, and have had conservation impact across more than 3 million square kilometres around the country. I was having trouble with changing the slides. There we go, earlier. Australia is, as many of you might know, a global biodiversity hotspot. There are species found here that are found nowhere else in the world. Our natural environment provides the conditions that support our well-being, our community, food security, and ultimately our economy. And despite this, our environmental trajectory continues to decline and the rate of biodiversity loss increases at unprecedented rates. The challenges that we face, though, are not unique. And Deb has mentioned that. Habitat loss, fragmentation, invasive species, declining environmental condition, compounding extreme weather events like floods, like fires and droughts, all exacerbated by a changing climate. Private landholders are critical land stewards and they're diverse in their motivations and their needs, but with one potential thing in common, which is their desire or obligation to steward the land that they're responsible for to a future left better for future generations and for their children. As the peak body for private land conservation, supporting connectivity, network building, and the sharing of knowledge and ideas is a really core mandate for our work. We can act as a platform, a convener, creating pathways for connection across themes and between organisations. So we really saw this opportunity to support the exchange program that would provide learning and insights from other global practices as critical, as vital, and also as exciting, because we haven't got any time to lose. So we have to learn from each other's challenges and our successes. We have to try new things, to continue to share, to adapt, to engage really deeply. And across the globe, our challenges can be similar. We might be applying different ways of doing that we've not yet tested. There might be a policy context out there that could be applied locally here, and vice versa. We're intentional about ALCA staying connected to this global stewardship exchange. We're connecting again online on policy and practice. Individual organisations are remaining connected around certain themes. There's discussions around water rights, discussions around connectivity conservation, around fire management. And on a personal level, as CEO of ALCA, I'll go to America next year on my own exchange to learn about private land conservation in the US. And my experience will be stronger for the relationships already now developed through the exchange that we've had the opportunity for. During the visit, relationships were built that will last well beyond the 3-week visit. This was just the beginning. We learned about each other, our ways of being, our ways of operating, our strengths. We shared practices, best practices, and Deb, as you mentioned, difficult practices. We tested each other's assumptions. We shared through demonstration and through presentation. We ate together, we walked together. Unfortunately, we may also have got a bit of COVID together. We're encouraged by individual relationships and dialogues that have been ongoing between individuals and organisations that met during the trip. There are tangible and intangible impacts from these kinds of exchanges and cross-country network developments, and subsequently a really critical need to continue them. I encourage, both our panel here today, but also the audience, to consider how you could be engaged in a global knowledge and practice exchange, and look forward to talking about that further with the panel as we continue. Thanks, Travis.
Thanks so much, Jody, and for those lovely pictures. Really appreciate that. Cecilia, could you jump in next and introduce yourself and the work of Trust for Nature and why you wanted to be involved in this exchange and what you got out of the experience?
Sure, Travis. Lovely to meet you all. Thanks, Shelana, Deb and Jody for your contributions so far. My name's Cecilia Riebl. I work as the policy advisor at Trust for Nature, which is the dedicated private land conservation organisation for the state of Victoria, which is the most southeastern state of the Australian mainland. Excuse me. And in that role, as the title suggests, I'm working closely with a range of stakeholders to sort of drive policy change around private land conservation. Wearing a different hat, I also am the regional representative for the International Land Conservation Network. Many of you will be familiar with the ILCN, but essentially, this is an organisation that, a little bit like ALCA, is a network of networks it is essentially an organisation with a role in bringing together conservation actors across the world to help drive or accelerate the pace and scale of conservation on ground. So obviously this peer exchange had a lot of relevance to the work that I do, both in my day job and through my regional representative role. And look, you know, I think it's already been flagged, but both through Trust for Nature and the ILCN, we're increasingly looking to find opportunities to learn, to cut corners and address common challenges like climate-induced drought, wildfire and disaster resilience, which of course are common in particular to the western coast of the US as well as the eastern coast of Australia. It was also really valuable to me to participate in this exchange because working in policy, I'm actually looking for solutions to problems. And when I do that in isolation, that can be really challenging. So I'll flag a few of the really exciting outcomes from a policy perspective that emerged from this exchange. So look, what did I get out of this? As we've already heard, I think being together is the number one, particularly after several years of lockdowns. I think walking together, talking together, sitting in around a circle, eating, maybe even exchanging COVID, all have their value. The inherent value of in-person connection can't be overstated, and what you get from that is really so important. I also really like that expression Deb used around co-creation, because I think the co-creation process of this peer exchange was unique. It wasn't something that I've come across before. The idea that a range of different steps were taken to actually embed relationships before we met in person was really, really, it was fantastic from my perspective. The introductory sessions on Zoom, the exchange of ideas, priorities, and agendas all helped to make that 3-week peer exchange incredibly worthwhile and sort of efficient, and helped us all to really cut to the chase of the really important things that we were there to talk about and deal with. I also, this is a tricky one, there are all sorts of intangibles, but I also just love hanging out with people from the US because they're culturally different and have different ways of communicating. And I really appreciated, particularly in some of the engagement and policy work that we did, the clarity and assertiveness of their communication style. So little things like that were also, really great from my perspective. So some of the sort of more tangible things that came from this, from my perspective, include that, I had some conversations that started as we walked around a zoo in Victoria on the theme of Indigenous-led conservation. And I think I had started that conversation with Travis and with Shelana. And what has resulted is a 2-part series through a webinar series through the ILCN on Indigenous-led conservation. And I'll do some shameless cross-promotion when I finish speaking and share the link to that in case anybody is interested. That webinar will include Shelana on the panel, as well as a US Terry Red Owl from the Bishop, who Shelana put us in touch with to speak about some of the sort of important issues and values around how we can achieve and better implement Indigenous-led conservation, particularly on private conservation lands. We also had an opportunity with members of the Peer Exchange group to meet in Canberra, Australia's capital, with some sort of senior government officials around a range of different issues. There was an opportunity to speak to the America the Beautiful legislation, to learn about how the US is now seeking to mobilise investments in locally led and voluntary conservation projects, and how that might tie back to the work that our new federal government is seeking to do. We also touched on federal income taxes, which is a real issue for us here in Australia. We're not effectively incentivising private land conservation here in Australia currently, and that is in contrast to some of the more progressive work that's happening in the States, particularly around income taxes. So there was an opportunity to share information about that, and there are ongoing steps being taken to engage our federal government around some of these issues. So that's really exciting and leads to practical and potentially significant policy outcomes. Look, there's lots more I could speak to, but I think I might leave it there, Travis, and we can head to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. And I'm glad you appreciated the Americanness of our group and some of the character traits that we maybe brought to conversations and socializing too. Shelana, can we round things out with you, and maybe you could share a little bit about your work and why you participated and some of the things that you got out of the experience?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Travis. Hi again, everybody. I'm Shelana deSilva. I use she, they pronouns. Calling in from, or zooming in, I should say, from Oakland, California, which is the unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone. I'm an independent consultant working at the intersection of justice and equity and landscape stewardship. I'm also a steering committee member of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. I have a background actually in immigrant rights organizing and found my way to climate change and conservation work around 15 years ago, and have really brought that lens of racial and social justice into the work of landscape stewardship and conservation. My start in this field of practice is in the land trust context. So like many of our speakers have already talked about, really doing on the ground, supporting on the ground conservation work and land protection for biodiversity, for habitat connectivity, through the lens of policy and advocacy work, and also raising public funding for projects. So that's sort of the background that I brought into this Global Landscape Stewards Exchange. But there were actually many things that were speaking to me in terms of, why would you want to do this aside from just the incredible opportunity of visiting Australia? What really started to come together for me in the year of planning and talking with our Australian colleagues is that while we're all engaged in landscape stewardship, there's of course so much place-based specificity, and the way everybody is approaching their work is really different. And there's so much innovation that I was learning from our Australian colleagues just in the planning. And so I think the main impetus for me was just a sheer curiosity to learn about how others, on the other side of the world are doing this work with so much heart and dedication, and to learn from them what they were bringing back. So there's curiosity there, but also I wanted to find a broader scale of community of practice. As an independent consultant, you might imagine that sometimes this work can be somewhat lonely. I benefit from these amazing collaborations with my clients, but I'm not situated in an organization. And I think so just on a personal level, being able to understand that when I think about something like 30 by 30, or in the US, our national initiative, America the Beautiful, that I could actually have colleagues in other parts of the world who are similarly focused, but doing things really differently given the specificity of their location or their region, but that we would be in a shared community of practice. So I think that curiosity and that desire for a bigger scale of community was what really drew me to this. And as I said, in the year of planning, it really proved out that the exchange itself was going to be such a rich experience. Learning from everybody through that planning work really brought that to life. But then, of course, when you go there, and as Cecilia said, it's really important to be walking on the land together, and to be on the land, hearing specifically how people are managing wildfire resilience, or how they are connecting habitat, how they're working with their communities to do that, where they're getting their funding support from. All of these different facets of the work just brought my own story to life in a way that I don't think I would have been possible without this exchange. And I'll give you a specific example. Cecilia mentioned that in our work talking about leveraging conservation financing through tax incentives, I learned that in Australia, many conservation actors rely on private philanthropy. Of course, we do too in the United States, but we have bond measures and conservation finance measures that also help us fill in that really complex formula of getting the funding that we need to do our work. And so there was just a lot of really dynamic exchange about, well, what does that mean when we can rely on these fund sources and y'all are relying on this set of fund sources? How does that actually change the approach and the way we do the work, who we talk to, how we partner with government entities or don't? And it just created a lot of really interesting questions and self-reflection that I think deepened my own understanding of my work, as well as taught me a lot, of course, about what my Australian colleagues are doing. There's so much more I think that I can say about what was learned, but I think maybe I'll leave it for Q&A and happy to share more. Thanks, Travis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shelana and Cecilia, Jody, Deb, for sharing your reflections on the experience. And I'll just add one more. In addition to the value of connecting in person, some of the pre-work that we did virtually, all of the different ideas, best practices, common challenges that we encountered, certainly all of those stand out for me. I think one of our colleagues who's I'm really grateful is on the call, Gary Howling from the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative. He had offered while we were engaged in exchange that for him, the value of the solidarity, feeling that you're not alone, was one of the things that really emerged as a top outcome or value in this kind of international peer exchange. And that was deeply resonant for me. I think we had the great privilege to interact with a lot of Australians interacting at different scales, farmers, private landholders, government officials, folks involved in conservation finance and policy, Torres Strait Islanders, and Aboriginal Australians doing this work. And across all of these different kinds of folks working at different scales and contexts, there was this shared sense of solidarity of, yes, we've got these great challenges that we're facing, but when we support each other and have global connections, we can feel like there's someone behind us helping us move forward and standing there with us as we face some of these challenges, sometimes in isolation. So I just wanted to call that out as another outcome that I felt really deeply. Shelana, you named some additional learnings and more things to unpack, and in a minute we'll drop a link in the chat with a report that the US participants in the exchange have pulled together to share some of their reflections and some of the key learnings that we walked away with from the exchange. So that is a further resource for folks to dive into. Otherwise, I'd really like to invite everyone to turn your cameras on if you are willing, and engage in some shared conversation with one another. I'd be curious if folks have any questions for our panelists about the peer exchange and global landscape stewards. Otherwise, we might pose some questions to you to engage in some dialogue around peer exchange and where there might be opportunities to do this in other regions of the globe going forward. So I'll look to folks. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to raise for our panelists? Gary, I see you've unmuted yourself.
I have indeed. Yep. Just to reflect and build a little bit more on what you were just talking about in relation to that sense of togetherness. To me, the whole process of the planning and the preparation for the event was perhaps the main period during which we built those relationships, because often, and we have this experience when the three connectivity initiatives from Australasia, ourselves, Gondwana Link and Reconnecting Northland get together, we have regular catch-ups at a more regional level. One of the things that we tend to do is spend a fair bit of time just reflecting on our day-to-day and the challenges that come about from what is the heart of the business that we're engaged in, which is essentially people. People are very much at the heart of both the problems that we face, but at the same time, the solutions that we're looking towards implementing. And when you're dealing with people, everybody comes with their own personality, their own nuances, their own difficulties and proclivities. And so it can be challenging on a personal level for us as practitioners on a day-to-day basis. And just knowing that, hearing how other people are actually dealing with exactly the same challenges. And one of the things that really struck me during that planning phase, and again, when we had that face-to-face time in person, when we finally got the three-dimensional version of each other, was also that fourth dimension, which is how we all adapt over time, and how we can pick up and learn from the experiences that others have gone through in the past, and how we can perhaps be forewarned and forearmed for the same challenges when we encounter them in future. Really appreciated that. Also, just want to reflect that a decade ago, 2012, 2013, Australia really was the world leader in connectivity conservation. We were the first country to establish a national wildlife corridors plan. But at the same time, we were also the first to step away from that large landscape and connectivity conservation perspective on a national policy front. But the work still has continued on. So to me, the history of the last decade in Australia has been very much about recognizing that the work that we're involved in is a long-term venture. Long-term ventures require long-term collaboration and partnership. And so in entering into things like a global stewardship network, we're really cognizant, and we'd encourage others to be likewise cognizant, that we're in this for the long haul together, and we will learn, we'll grow, we'll get old together collectively through this process. And I'm looking forward to continuing to get even older than I already feel right now with all of you. So again, thank you for the visit. Thoroughly enjoyed having you here. COVID made a real mess of some of the really, really good plans that we had. So apologies again for that. But viruses will do what viruses do.
Thank you so much, Gary, for your reflections and commitment too. I appreciate that. And Tani for jumping on too from Great Eastern Ranges. I appreciate you starting your day with us. What about others who are joining? Do you have additional questions or comments on what the panelists shared?
Travis, until there's a question, I just wanted to throw out something about scale, because I don't think that what we did was incredibly unique, and I think we hope to replicate and do more of these, but I think there's different forms of exchange that can happen either within a country or also maybe more site specific. And I did reference that, CLLC has been doing exchanges for years. We do a lot of knowledge exchange within a country, or we bring people here to learn about connectivity conservation. One of our staff was just in Turkmenistan running was there for 3 weeks doing field tours, but also connectivity workshops. So I think there's different ways we can do these exchanges, but I want to call out something that Deb Lev and I have been talking about, is the idea of an Indigenous Guardians program too, and building that cohort. And I know Australia has a history of that, and an Indigenous Guardians program. I'm bringing that up as an example of different ways to build this kind of exchange and partnership and learning. And I don't know if anyone from Australia wants to just kind of give a glimpse into what that program is and why it's been so successful, and how here in the United States, we're trying to figure out if we can build something similar. Canada has run with that, taking a lot of lessons from Australia, but I'm putting you guys on the spot, I guess.
happy to talk briefly on that. So I think what you're referencing there is our Indigenous Protected Area program, which has been up and running for over a decade or so, which recognises Indigenous held lands and supports through funding, resourcing Indigenous ranger programs to be out on country managing land. The Indigenous Protected Area state now manages a very significant proportion of the country, with Indigenous rangers working on the ground out right around the country, remotely, regionally, with small teams, small capacity and massive landscapes to steward into the future, but do so through their own self-determination, through the development of their own land management plans, and the implementation of a protected area through culture and knowledge. And, as mentioned, sort of 60,000 odd years of experience and shared wisdoms, building and benefiting from the opportunities for economic development that might come through the different ways and practices of sustainable land management. It still needs more work, it still needs more resourcing, support, more rangers on the ground, more boots on the ground, more coordinators, and more funding to be ongoing and effective. And there's a large body of groups and alliances that are working hard to keep building and advocating for those efforts.
If I could just jump in again briefly, Travis, just by way of observation, I think part of the value of having a network like this is that you don't need to have the experience yourself. You can live experiences vicariously through others. So when it comes to the issue of Aboriginal or traditional owner networks and how to engage with them, we obviously, as a peak organization, we're essentially a backbone organization like Centre for Large Landscape Conservation, but for connectivity conservation in Eastern Australia. So we work with a network of over 250 organizations who are doing things on the ground. But importantly for us, we have those relationships with the likes of Reconnecting Northland over in New Zealand, who have a very, very strong Maori-based approach to the work and the philosophy of how they're approaching connectivity conservation. And they themselves have an extensive network through the broader Pacific region, through into Micronesia and beyond. So it's really interesting for me to be able to hear about how they, in their context, are engaging with others in a slightly different context, but to whom they have close, to some extent, cultural relationships or cultural parallels. So I guess that's one aspect that I'm particularly looking forward to out of the relationship with the North American based network, to hear about how you're engaging in collaboration and partnerships with your traditional owners, your First Nations people, so that we're still to some extent learning and trying to overcome some of the past problems that we've had in Australia. We're still looking to work beyond some of those past injustices here and get on the front foot again in terms of some of that engagement. So I guess I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you guys, as I'm sure you are from us, but I'm particularly interested in hearing from you.
Thanks for those contributions, Gary. And I see, Tanya, you want to jump in, and then Deb, you raised your hand too, so I'd love to hear from both of you.
Yeah, sure. I was actually going to say something very similar to my colleague Gary, and that is on the Indigenous Protected Area Program and Indigenous Ranger Program is incredibly valuable and much needed. But I'd say that Australia as a country, we have a long way to go in terms of making it kind of common practice to weave that traditional knowledge and sense of knowing into with modern science to kind of get that better impact and greater impact on the ground. So there are these fantastic programs, but in terms of how many organizations and government work day to day, Indigenous owners are still often added in at the end of the process, often as kind of a tick box exercise, and we need to be a lot better as a country in terms of actively collaborating, engaging, partnering with First Nations groups in Australia to get those greater outcomes, and also acknowledge and celebrate the incredible tens of thousands of years of traditional knowledge that we have in this country that is so incredibly valuable. And I was just touched by going into the Northern Territory, where traditional burning is common practice, and just seeing how scientific it actually is, how it's creating those much better outcomes on the ground in terms of providing animals with, you know, areas that they can move into, with regenerating habitat, because it's cool burning, whilst in states like New South Wales, where we're still going with what I call the hazard burn, where it's just kind of large, you know, large burnings, high intensity, where they're burning the canopy of the trees. Traditional owners never do that sort of thing. You know, there's so we've got some fantastic programs in place, but I would say we're probably at the beginning of where we need to be in the long term. So very valuable to learn from you guys, but also other countries like New Zealand and also Africa in how that is common practice and how they are actively working with First Nations in a non-tokenistic manner.
Yeah, thanks for those contributions, Tanya, and appreciate hearing from our Australian colleagues on this topic. Deb, did you want to chime in with some additional comments or a question?
Deb Love or Deb Davidson?
Deb Love.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. I'm Deb Love. I work for an organization called Resources Legacy Fund, and we've been working with the Canadian Guardians programs for quite some time. And I just want to say, Tandy, I hear you that you feel like you're in the early stages, but I will just assure you that we all in the States hear about how incredible Canada is, and then Canada is talking about Australia being the model. And I have literally heard time and time again of the First Nations Guardians in Canada, their visits to Australia and how inspiring that was for them. And now we're in a position where we've got Indigenous leaders here in the United States who have had an opportunity to go up to Canada and to visit Guardians programs there and come back ready to start something up. And so next week, I have the privilege of going up to Ottawa with 6 Indigenous Guardians, just emerging programs here in the States, in the Northern Rockies and in Alaska. But there will be over 500 Indigenous Guardians gathered next week. And I would say one of the most exciting things was that the government of Canada committed $175 million to these programs and committed funding for the first ever network. And so it's really exciting to see that kind of scaffolding come into play, and a reminder of how long this takes to build these programs. So I know Deb and I have spoken a lot about just beginning the program by listening and providing opportunities for knowledge sharing. And that's, you know, it is going to take a long time, but I do feel really strongly that what you all have been doing has laid the groundwork for so many others. And an Indigenous leader recently said to me something that really struck a chord. She talked about the kinship routes between the tribes and First Nations in Canada, and how they have always, since time immemorial, shared information and knowledge as they've traveled, and colonialism has disrupted those kinship routes. And she really feels like the knowledge sharing opportunities that we have are reinstating those traditional kinship routes. So again, it's really a pleasure to be with you guys and to hear about your wonderful knowledge sharing, and look forward to hopefully someday coming down and seeing it all myself.
You would be welcome.
Thank you for sharing that, Deb. That's really beautiful. Very resonant. I think we have time for one additional question or comment. Jody?
Happy for someone else to go there. Just to expand on the discussion, I guess it was more of a comment or a reflection around funders and supporters of the work that we do. I'm not sure if there are any on the call today, but I think one of the important parts of this was the coming together and the building a network of funders as a sort of intentional or unintentional part of the work that we were doing from its original outset, but that I have had reflections about the benefits that some of our Australian funders received through the Global Stewardship Exchange and the forums that we're able to co-design and bring together, with the opportunity to connect with US funders and to hear and understand some of the motivations that were occurring, and a potential intention for them to continue their own network and exchange of knowledge and ideas around funding for the kinds of work that we're doing. And I think that's something we haven't touched on yet, and just worth noting.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Jody. I really appreciated that particular event where we were able to get together with some Australian funders and practitioners, and I think it kind of broke the ice having us there in a way, because it was not a pitch fest, it was a knowledge sharing experience, and I appreciated that tone being able to be said, and I look forward to having future opportunities like that down the road.
And recognizing that the comments, sorry, just reflecting on the comments
Go ahead,
you said
Jody.
earlier around some of the things we appreciated was the ability that your group was able to communicate about funding in a different way, communicate about the work that you're doing in a different way. And I think what's come back and reflected to me repeatedly from a number of our participants was the generosity that your group brought to Australia, generosity of knowledge, of sharing, of information giving, and openness and transparency that it was a very common reflection from our Australian participants in the exchange. So thank you for that. It was enlightening and inspiring for us all to be part of.
Thank you, Jody. And thanks to all of our panelists and participants who joined this evening or this morning. It was really great to connect with all of you and reflect on this experience together. In the chat, Kat linked the webpage to Global Landscape Stewards, where we're beginning to add some resources, including a report summarizing some of our reflections from the exchange. And we're going to be looking to some additional virtual opportunities and in-person opportunities for exchange with Australians and folks from the US and other regions of the globe. So I'd encourage you to stay tuned and stay connected. I think I'll hand it back to Kat, who's going to share a little bit about upcoming opportunities with the Network for Landscape Conservation in the webinar world.
Thank you so much, Travis. And thank you all so much for joining and being committed to have this conversation together to explore the Australia Exchange. It's inspiring to hear all of the sharing and knowledge that we had today. I just wanted to let you know that this recording will be uploaded in a few days. So for folks who want to share this with their colleagues and have this conversation, or for folks who'd like to revisit any portion of this webinar, it'll be on our website. And in addition, we have an upcoming opportunity that I just put in the chat, focused on connecting and protecting building enduring Appalachian Climate Corridor on Wednesday, May 24th in the US time. So we're going to be hearing from individuals with the focus on the needs and opportunities for working at scale, building conservation corridors around trails, and how to spur local climate action at the local scale. You can read more about it on that website and get signed up. And also just want to acknowledge Sharon that shared the report that has just come out for the Australia Exchange. So please read through that. We've also included that in the description. So if you get lost or want to know where that link is, please reach out. With that being said, I know it's late here or early in Australia, so I just greatly appreciate the time. Thank you all for your commitment to having this conversation, and to all the panelists, a big round of applause, virtually or physically, and very much looking forward to continuing the conversation as we move forward in the webinar series and with this community. So really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a good one.
Thanks,
Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Catch you
Thanks,
later.
everyone.
Speak soon, Travis.
Yeah, we will.